due to Russia's aggressive plans towards Western European countries. The Russian Federation has all the means to wipe everyone off the face of the earth. And as Goebbels once said, the more unbelievable the lie, the faster people will believe it.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has publicly stated for the second time this month that Russia's war against Ukraine is nearing its end. But at the same time, he stated that Europe is preparing for an open war with the Russians. And immediately he threatened Armenia with war as it tries to break away from the Russians and move toward the European Union. This is how you can briefly describe today's address by Putin. Today, the Russian dictator was raving that the Russian army is allegedly breaking through along the entire front, and therefore negotiations are not needed. He told a story about how the Europeans themselves provoked the war in Ukraine, as if it wasn't Russia that started the war and wasn't the aggressor. He also commented on the bold misunderstanding and the attack of a Russian drone on Romania. But most of all, Vladimir Putin talked today about Armenia, which is leaving Russia's sphere of influence. And here, Putin actually compared the situation in Ukraine, the Russian attack on Ukraine in 2014, and what is happening in Armenia today, hinting that Russia might attack Yerevan as well. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave any comment, and subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link is in this video's description.
We must strengthen air defense, and we are doing this and will continue to do so. And regarding my statement that in my opinion the matter is coming to a close, I made this statement for a reason based on an analysis of the situation on the battlefield. And there our troops are advancing in all directions. Well, you see it every single day.
So, the bold little dwarf Vladimir Putin, while in Kazakhstan, once again started talking about the war in Ukraine coming to an end based on an analysis of the battlefield. He claims that the Russians are breaking through along the entire front line so much that they will soon achieve their goals. Next is a quote from Putin. As for my statement that, in my opinion, the war is approaching its end, I made this statement for a reason, based on an analysis of the situation on the battlefield. And there our troops are advancing in all directions. Well, you see it every single day. At the same time, the Kremlin leader said that he cannot talk about the timing of the end of the war while hostilities are ongoing. I'll just note here that this same Putin has been telling the wild Russians for 12 years now that Russia is just about to win, just a little bit more to go. But I'll also remind you that literally on May 9th, Putin stated that he is ready to meet with the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, in some third country, but only to sign the final agreements on ending the war. At the same time, Putin stated, and I quote, that the Ukrainian conflict is coming to an end. And on May 12th, Putin's press secretary, Dmytro Peskov, explained the words of the balding dictator about the supposed approach of ending the war against Ukraine by referring to progress in the peace process and the mediating efforts of the US. However, there are still no specific dates. Putin said, which once again emphasizes that Putin and his circle understand perfectly well that even the wild, unwashed Russians realize they are at a dead end, so they need to be fed fairy tales every day that just a little bit more and they will have won. But regarding the peace process, Vladimir Putin himself stated today that despite Russia and the US maintaining contacts as part of the Ukraine peace process, the parties are not in talks. In addition, Volodymyr Putin began to threaten Europe, stating that he has the means to wipe out anyone who wants to destroy bases on Russian territory. This was his response to the words of the Lithuanian foreign minister, who stated that NATO has the means to wipe out Russian air defense bases in the Kaliningrad region. And right away, Vladimir Putin decided to explain that it's not the Russians who are aggressive, no, not at all, it's the Europeans who are aggressive. Pinka stated that Russia, quote, Russia has not threatened European countries, and statements by European politicians about preparing for war with the Russian Federation are being used to continue confrontation with Moscow and to justify excessive spending from their country's budgets. Commenting on statements by representatives of the European Union about preparing for war with Russia, Vladimir Putin called such claims nonsense, lies, and blatant and brazen falsehoods. In addition, Putin stated that it is Western countries that are responsible for the tragedy unfolding today in Ukraine. According to him, it was they who pushed the situation to the point of a coup d'etat in 2014, which, as it turns out, is why Russia took a number of actions first in Crimea and then in Donbass. And now, the most interesting part. Putin says that Europeans are brazenly and shamelessly lying when they claim that Russia is threatening Europe. But let me remind you that Vladimir Putin himself assured that there were no Russians in Crimea or Donbass. I remind you of his famous phrase, "We are not there." In 2014 and 2015, this bold jerk was assuring everyone that no, come on, those in Donbass are militia who pulled tanks out of the mines and went to fight. This is just to say that Russians are lying scum. And now Putin says, well, yes, because of the coup in Ukraine, we were forced to start operations in Crimea and then in Donbass. But next, I'll quote Putin about Europe. They caused today's tragedy and are now shifting blame from the guilty to the innocent, making Russia appear as the aggressor. No, it's their policy. From the very first step, when they deceived us by saying there would never be any expansion, that supposedly NATO would not move a single step eastward, to the tragedy in Ukraine with the coup d'etat. This is all the result of their policy, and they shouldn't deceive their own people. Russia has never threatened and does not threaten European countries. Everything they do is only to continue the confrontation with Russia and to justify the excessive spending from their country's budgets, digging into the pockets of European taxpayers. But the most interesting part of the statements made by the bald dictator Putin concerned Armenia. Then he began to compare the start of Russia's war against Ukraine in 2014 with the current situation in the relations between Russia and Armenia. Quote, "The crisis in Ukraine began with a situation that was similar to what is happening now in Armenia. I have already mentioned this. The crisis in Ukraine once began with attempts by Ukraine to join the European Union. We were not against it. After that, Putin presented a list of demands to Armenia. Demands? Who do you think you are? What is that? After the meeting of the Eurasian Economic Union, bald-headed Putin said that Armenia needs to hold a referendum as soon as possible on joining the European Union and leaving the EAEU. Although, who in Armenia ever asked for Putin's opinion anyway? Who is Putin to say that a referendum needs to be held in another country? What else did he demand? And then Putin went on to explain in detail what losses Armenia would suffer if it left the Eurasian Economic Union and moved closer to the EU. Putin warned Armenia about the differences between the mechanisms of the European Union and the EAEU, as well as the need for time and investment to transition to European standards. And if you want to have a laugh, here is a statement from Vladimir Putin. The EAEU has a broader, well-protected market, duty-free trade, unified technical and phytosanitary standards, simplified logistics, as well as the free movement of goods and services. Well, in case you didn't know, Europe doesn't have any of this. What are you talking about? Only Russia can do something like this. And as expected, Vladimir Putin started manipulating energy prices. He stated that in Europe, prices are, quote, on average around 600 euros, while for the EAEU countries, it's about 150 euros. Well, let's be honest, what else can Putin, like any other Russian, brag about besides natural resources? But these are people who simply live off the riches of the land. They don't produce anything themselves, they're just dumb savages who simply pump oil and gas from the ground and sell it all. Putin also touched on the issue of labor migration. He started threatening that Armenian citizens working in Russia could lose their jobs. They would be forced to get some kind of work permits and so on. He also noted that Armenia would have to return to a permit system for freight carriers, and the tariffs for railway transportation may be raised from the domestic Russian level to the rates for CIS countries. By the way, if you don't remember, or maybe you've already forgotten, maybe the CIS still exists. There you go. And in the end, that bold jerk, Vladimir Putin, thought that supposedly all this could lead to the loss of, quote, at least 14% of Armenia's GDP. But let me remind you, as I said in previous episodes, It's obvious. It's obvious that in Armenia they clearly understand that a transition period is needed, that certain preferences should also be demanded from the Europeans, so that this transition period is really as minimally painful as possible. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.